For most of the world, Okinawa is a beach, a subtropical chain of islands at the southern edge of Japan. White sand, blue water, coral reefs. The place Japanese honeymooners go in winter. The place Americans associate with a military base, if they associate it with anything at all. All of that is true. But for 450 years before the beaches were tourist beaches, Okinawa was something else entirely. It was an independent kingdom. It had its own king, its own court, its own language, its own religion, its own treaties with China, Korea, and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. That kingdom is gone now. Its palace has been destroyed 5 times. The language is fading. The religion has been suppressed. The treaties were torn up in a single afternoon in 1879, when a Japanese officer marched into the royal court with 300 soldiers behind him and told the king he had 2 days to leave. And yet, the people who live on these islands today still do not, mostly, call themselves Japanese. They call themselves Okinawan. They call their language Uchinaguchi. They call their islands not Okinawa, but Ryukyu. And when they speak about the year 1879, when their kingdom officially became a Japanese prefecture, they do not call it annexation or unification or reform. They call it disposition, as in the disposing of something. Why? Why does the only place in Japan that has been Japanese on paper for nearly 150 years still call itself by another name? The answer is buried under coral sand, inside limestone caves, and beneath the fences of one of the most heavily militarized stretches of coastline in the modern world. This is Okinawa. This is the story Japan does not always want to tell. The title of this documentary makes a claim that needs to be addressed early. The island Japan almost gave up. Twice, really. The first time was in 1945. As American forces moved north across the Pacific, the Japanese Imperial Army made a strategic decision about Okinawa. It would not be defended to win. It would be defended to delay. The home islands needed time. The 32nd Army, stationed in Okinawa, was told to hold the southernmost prefecture as long as possible, while the mainland prepared its own defense. They understood what that meant. So did the people of Okinawa, though no one told them directly. By the end of those 82 days, roughly 1 in 4 Okinawans were dead. The second time came later. After the war, the rest of Japan returned to sovereignty in 1952. Okinawa did not. For another 20 years, the island lived under American administration. Even after it was returned to Japan in 1972, the bases stayed. Today, 70% of all American military installations in Japan sit on this one prefecture, which makes up less than 1% of the country's land. Japan never officially gave up Okinawa, but the people who live there have spent 50 years asking whether anyone in Tokyo really fights for it the way they would fight for Hokkaido, or Kyoto, or Tokyo itself. That question has no comfortable answer, but the question is the documentary. To understand what was lost, it helps to see what was here first. The Ryukyu Islands stretch 600 miles between the southern tip of Kyushu and the northern tip of Taiwan. There are roughly 160 of them. 47 are inhabited. The largest, where most people live, is called Okinawa Island. From a plane, it looks like a long, narrow leaf, 60 miles end to end, never more than 20 miles wide. The water that surrounds it is the warm, shallow water of the East China Sea, fed from the south by the Kuroshio Current, the Pacific's equivalent of the Gulf Stream. That current is the reason for everything that came after. In the 15th century, while Europe was still figuring out how to sail east, Okinawan ships were already running a triangle between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. They were not large ships. The kingdom had no real army, no real navy in the military sense. What it had was geography. It sat at the crossroads of 4 major maritime trade routes. Anyone moving silk from China to Japan, or porcelain to Vietnam, or sugar back to Korea, eventually moved it through Okinawan ports. A kingdom that did not need to conquer anyone got rich anyway. The capital of that kingdom sat on a hill above what is now the modern city of Naha. Its name was Shuri. Shuri Castle is unlike any other castle in Japan. It is not grey stone or white plaster. It is painted vermilion red with gold and black detailing and dragons coiled around its pillars. It looks more like the Forbidden City than like Himeji or Osaka. That is not accidental. For 5 centuries, the Ryukyuan kings took their architectural and ceremonial cues from China, because China was the kingdom's most important trading partner and the kingdom's most important diplomatic protector. Inside the throne hall, the king sat beneath a Chinese-style canopy, surrounded by court officials in robes that would have looked at home in Beijing. He sent tribute missions to the Ming and Qing emperors every 2 years. In return, the Chinese court formally recognized him as the legitimate ruler of an independent kingdom and authorized his ships to trade at Chinese ports. For 400 years, this arrangement worked. Then Japan arrived. In 1609, the Satsuma clan of southern Kyushu sent a fleet south. 3,000 men, more than 100 war junks. They captured Shuri Castle, took the king prisoner, and forced the kingdom into vassalage. The king at the time was Sho Nei. When the Satsuma forces broke through the final defensive line, he gave his army a single order before surrendering. Nuchidu Takara. Life is a treasure. The soldiers laid down their weapons. The Satsuma kept Ryukyu officially independent. For Chinese diplomatic purposes, the kingdom still had to look like a sovereign state. Japan at the time was not on speaking terms with China, and the Satsuma clan needed Ryukyu's tribute trade as a back channel. So they hid behind the throne. This arrangement lasted another 270 years. 2 emperors, 1 kingdom paying tribute to both. The king carrying out elaborate court rituals on Chinese instructions, while Japanese administrators behind the curtain controlled the trade routes and collected the real taxes. It worked, in its strange way, until the world changed. In the late 19th century, Japan modernized. The shoguns fell. The Meiji Emperor consolidated a new centralized state and began drawing hard borders around what would from then on be Japanese territory. Hokkaido in the north, the Bonin Islands to the east, and Okinawa to the south. In 1872, the Meiji government unilaterally declared the Ryukyu kingdom to be the Ryukyu domain. The king was no longer a king. He was now a Japanese feudal lord. China, which had been informally protecting the kingdom for 500 years, protested. The Japanese ignored them. 7 years later, even the pretense ended. March 27, 1879. A Japanese officer named Matsuda arrives in Naha with 300 or 400 soldiers and 160 policemen at his back. He marches up the hill to Shuri Castle. He delivers a formal notice to the royal household. The Ryukyu domain is being abolished. Okinawa prefecture is being established. The king has 2 days to leave the palace. His name is Shotai. He is 36 years old. He has been king for 31 of those 36 years. His family has held this castle with brief interruptions since 1429. He leaves quietly. 2 days later, the Japanese officer walks unopposed into Shuri Castle. Shotai is escorted to Tokyo, given a marquis title in the new Japanese nobility, and lives out the remaining 22 years of his life as a footnote in another country's aristocracy. He never returns to Okinawa. The kingdom that had survived a Mongol demand for tribute, a Japanese invasion, 2 centuries of dual vassalage, and the arrival of every major Western power in the 19th century, ended with 2 days' notice. The Japanese language was made standard in schools. Speaking Uchinaguchi was punished. Children who used Ryukyuan words were forced to wear wooden signs around their necks, identifying them as dialect speakers. The Noro, the female priestesses who had served as the spiritual guardians of every village for generations, were quietly retired in favor of Shinto. The royal family's documents were carried off to Tokyo, where most of them sit in archives to this day. Most Okinawans alive today are descended from people who watched their kingdom end and were told, in the years afterward, that this had been a natural unification, that they had always been Japanese, really, that the kingdom had been an aberration. They have spent 150 years politely disagreeing, but the islands themselves predate any of this. To understand what Okinawa is, geologically, ecologically, before any human got here at all, it helps to leave the main island and head south. Through the Karama Group, past Miyako, to the Yaeyama Islands at the very southern end of the prefecture, less than 70 miles from Taiwan. There, on the second largest island in the chain, is one of the strangest forests in East Asia.
Iriomote is mostly jungle.
80% of the island is covered in subtropical rainforest, ringed by Japan's largest mangrove network. There is one road. It runs along the eastern coastline and ends at a cliff. The interior is functionally trackless. The Urauchi River, the largest river in Okinawa Prefecture, winds back into terrain that has never been settled and may never be. On Iriomote, the rhythm of the forest goes on as it has for tens of thousands of years. The mangroves rise and fall with the tide. The Urauchi River carries silt out to the reef. The habu, the venomous pit viper that gives the local rice wine its name, waits among the rocks. The fruit bats glide between the canopy, and the island slowly counts down the years it has left of the only animal that ever made it its own. North of Iriomote, back on Okinawa Island itself, sits another endemic creature with a similar story. The Okinawa rail is a flightless bird. It is dark brown and chestnut red, with a heavy red bill and bright pink legs. It lives in the dense, subtropical broadleaf forest of the Yanbaru region, in the north of the island, near the limit of where the American military training areas reach. It cannot fly, because, for most of its evolutionary history, it did not need to. No mammalian predators lived on Okinawa Island. The rail walked everywhere. When Western scientists first formally described the bird in 1981, it was already endangered. They had named a new species and listed it as threatened in the same paper. Mongooses, introduced from India in 1910 to control the habu, never controlled the habu. They turned out to be active during the day, while the habu is nocturnal. The two species barely encountered each other. What the mongooses did eat was the rail. Within 70 years, the bird's population had collapsed. Conservation programs since the 1990s have brought it back from the edge. Special fencing keeps mongooses out of breeding territories. Drivers in the north are warned by roadside signs that the rail walks. The bird has not recovered fully, but it has stopped vanishing. It still cannot fly. Out beyond the conservation fences, in the cane fields and the limestone outcrops, lives a creature far less endangered. The Okinawan habu is a pit viper. It is golden green, slender, and grows to nearly 2 meters in length. It is the largest and most venomous snake on the island. It lives in stone walls, in the gaps between coral graves, and in the undergrowth along forest edges. It is nocturnal. It ambushes its prey. It is responsible for a small but consistent number of serious bites each year. The habu has been part of Okinawan life for as long as there has been Okinawan life. It appears in folk tales. It is sometimes pickled, whole, in jars of awamori, the local distilled rice spirit. A tradition some claim has medicinal value, and others maintain is mostly about intimidating dinner guests. Country children grow up learning the habu's habits, the way mainland Japanese children learn the seasons of cherry blossoms. It is one of the few species on the island whose population has not declined under modern pressures. The reasons say something about the place. The habu lives in the walls of the dead, the limestone tombs that dot the southern hills, the old stone fences, the ruins. It thrives in the spaces people have stopped maintaining. It is, in a sense, a creature whose territory has expanded as the population of the countryside has aged and shrunk. In a sense, this is what makes Okinawa what it is. A place where things stay, even when staying makes no sense. Where a kingdom keeps remembering itself for 150 years after the kingdom ended. Where a bird that cannot fly keeps walking through forests where almost everything wants to eat it. Where a language survives in the speech of grandmothers and the chants of priestesses and the lyrics of songs played on 3-stringed instruments at festivals. So how does a place like this hold on to itself? The answer is partly geographic, partly cultural, and partly the simple fact that Okinawans have never had the luxury of forgetting who they were. Back on the main island, an hour's drive north of Naha, sits a small village called Yomitan. It is unremarkable from the road. Sugarcane fields, low concrete houses, a fishing port. But Yomitan is where many of the cultural traditions of the kingdom never quite finished dying. Sanshin music is taught here, the 3-stringed lute that originated in China and was redesigned in Okinawa around a wooden body wrapped in snakeskin. Kachashi, the traditional folk dance performed at festivals and weddings, is still performed here at the slightest excuse. And every August, when the Obon season arrives, the village fills with the sound of Asa drumming, the call and response performance art that started as a Buddhist memorial ritual and has, over the centuries, become something closer to a celebration of being alive. The lyrics of many Asa songs are in Uchinaguchi. The drummers do not always know exactly what the words mean. They have been passed down. The meaning is in the act. One of those cultural exports has traveled further than the kingdom that produced it. Karate, the word means empty hand, was developed in Okinawa, not in Japan. Its roots go back to the kingdom era, when the ruling class periodically restricted civilian access to bladed weapons. Commoners who wanted to defend themselves learned to do so without them. They borrowed techniques from Chinese martial arts that arrived with traders and envoys, mixed them with local fighting traditions called te, and trained in private, sometimes at night, in courtyards lit only by oil lamps. By the 19th century, 3 regional styles had taken shape. Shuri-te, refined and quick, developed in the royal capital. Naha-te, emphasizing breathing and power, took root in the port city below. Tamari-te, balanced between the two, emerged in a fishing village between them. These were later codified in the 20th century into the Shorin-ryu, Goju-ryu, and Uechi-ryu schools that practitioners around the world recognize today. Karate first crossed to mainland Japan in the 1920s. From there, after the war, it crossed to the Americans who occupied Okinawa, and from there to the rest of the world. Today, there are tens of millions of practitioners on 6 continents. In 2018, UNESCO listed Okinawan karate as intangible cultural heritage. What most students of the art outside of Okinawa do not always know is that the art exists at all because the kingdom that created it was forbidden by its larger neighbors from carrying weapons. Karate is not a martial art that grew out of conquest. It grew out of accommodation, in a kingdom that had to find ways to defend itself with what it was allowed to keep. One of the most important figures in the survival of the Ryukyuan language was a man named Ifa Fuyu. He was born in Naha in 1876, 3 years before the kingdom was abolished. He went to Tokyo for university. He returned to Okinawa, convinced that if the language and culture were not documented quickly, they would be lost within a generation. He spent his life cataloging Uchinaguchi, its grammar, its poetry, its proverbs, the names of villages, of plants, of fish, of household objects. He established the academic field of Okinawan studies and made the case, in books published in both Tokyo and Naha, that Ryukyuan culture deserved to be treated as a culture in its own right, and not merely as a regional variant of Japan. He died in 1947, 2 years after the battle that destroyed most of what he had spent his life studying. But the work was done by then. The dictionaries existed, the grammars existed, the poems were transcribed. When younger generations of Okinawans began, in the 1980s, to ask who they had been before they were Japanese, the answer was waiting for them on the shelves Ifa Fuyu had filled. Yomitan is one of the places where that recovery is most visible. Children take Uchinaguchi lessons in school, alongside Japanese and English. Elderly residents lead workshops in traditional weaving and pottery. The local research council studies why the village's older population lives so long, and whether their grandchildren will. In the heart of Naha, a few blocks from the modern shopping arcades, there is a neighborhood of low tile-roofed buildings, narrow stone alleys, and the smell of wood smoke. This is Tsuboya. It has been the city's pottery district for almost 400 years. The kilns here were built in the 1680s, when the Ryukyu kingdom consolidated the island's scattered ceramic traditions in one place. Tsuboya potters produced everything from the rough storage jars used for awamori to the glazed roof tiles for Shuri Castle to the small ceramic shisa, the lion-dog guardian figures that still sit on every Okinawan rooftop, paired and watchful. One with its mouth open to invite in good fortune, one with its mouth closed to keep it from leaving. When Naha was leveled in 1945, the Tsuboya kilns were among the few structures that remained partially intact. Pottery resumed almost immediately after the war ended, in part because the American administration needed containers and household ware. Some of the families working here today trace their craft back through 8 generations of fathers and daughters and apprentices. That last question matters more than it sounds, because Okinawa is also the place where one of the most famous claims about the human lifespan was first measured. In the 1970s, a team of demographers began noticing that Okinawans were living, on average, longer than almost any other population on Earth. The northern village of Ogimi, in particular, had a striking number of residents who had crossed the age of 100. Researchers from outside Japan flew in to study them. They published papers, they wrote books, they coined a term, blue zone, for a small set of places around the world where extreme longevity was statistically overrepresented. Ogimi became, almost overnight, one of the most studied villages in human nutrition science. The findings were not surprising once they were stated. The diet was mostly plant-based: sweet potato, tofu, leafy greens, modest portions of fish, very little meat. The lifestyle was active without being athletic: gardening, walking, climbing in and out of low chairs and onto tatami mats several dozen times a day. The social structure included moai, small, lifelong groups of friends who pooled money in times of crisis and visited each other regularly across decades. And the culture had a word, ikigai, that translated roughly as a reason to get up in the morning. Every centenarian researchers interviewed had one. What the early Blue Zone researchers did not always emphasize is that the diet that produced the world's longest-lived population was also, in part, the diet of a kingdom that had been historically poor. Sweet potato and tofu were what people ate because rice was expensive. Vegetables were what gardens grew. Pork was reserved for festivals. The Okinawan longevity miracle, in other words, was partly the longevity of people who had spent their lives without much. That part of the story has begun to change. Younger Okinawans eat differently. American fast food has been on the island since the bases arrived in 1945. The longevity statistics for men under 60 have been declining for 30 years. The Blue Zone is still there, but it is graying faster than it is renewing. In the small mountain village of Ogimi, the elderly women who keep this tradition alive still maintain vegetable gardens behind their houses. They still walk to the local community center for tea. They still belong to moai groups that have been meeting since they were teenagers. Of the original members of some of these groups, only a few remain. They have outlived the kingdom their grandparents were born into. They have outlived the war that ended their parents' world. They have outlived an American administration they still remember, and a return to Japan they are still ambivalent about. What they will not outlive, almost certainly, is the burden that still sits on these islands. To see that burden plainly drive south, past the cane fields, past the highway interchange, past the low concrete sprawl of central Okinawa, and into the area between Naha and the town of Okinawan. Here, the road runs along a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Beyond the fence, a stretch of flat ground that is unmistakably an airfield. Hangars in the distance, the wing of a transport aircraft visible above a rise, a double row of warning signs in English and Japanese. This is Marine Corps Air Station Futenma. It sits in the middle of a city of close to 100,000 people. From the air, it looks like a runway that has been dropped almost arbitrarily into a residential grid. Schools are within a few hundred meters of the perimeter, so are hospitals. The flight path of every aircraft taking off passes directly over civilian rooftops. In 1996, after a particularly damaging string of incidents involving American service members and Okinawan civilians, the United States and Japan agreed in principle to close the base and move its operations elsewhere on the island. The relocation was meant to take 5 years. It has now taken 30. The replacement site, in Hinoko Bay on the eastern side of the island, requires construction of an airfield on landfill extended out into the sea. Okinawan voters have rejected the project repeatedly in prefectural referenda. The Tokyo government has overridden them repeatedly. Construction continues. The water at Hinoko until recently was home to the last small remaining population of dugongs in Japanese waters. The dugong is a large, herbivorous marine mammal, a cousin of the manatee. It eats seagrass and very little else. The Okinawan dugong was once a fixture of the eastern coastline. Sailors knew it. Fishermen carved its likeness into amulets. The species was sacred in some Ryukyuan traditions associated with the sea god, whose protection the kingdom depended on. By the time the Hinoko construction began in the early 2000s, fewer than 50 individuals were thought to remain in Okinawan waters. Today, the population is functionally extinct as a breeding group. The last confirmed sighting near Hinoko was in 2019. The base will be built. The dugong is not coming back. 20 miles north of Futenma, the perimeter fence of Kadena Air Base stretches for almost 12 miles around the central part of the island. Kadena is the largest American air base in the Pacific. Its 2 parallel runways are each nearly 4 kilometers long. F-15s, surveillance aircraft, and tankers operate from its flight line around the clock. The base is not hidden. It is the dominant feature of the landscape. The road that runs north from Naha passes alongside it for almost an hour of driving. From the residential neighborhoods that surround the base, the windows shake when a fighter takes off. The people who live in those neighborhoods are not anti-American by inclination. Many work on the base, many married American service members. Many have family members in California or Texas. The complaint is more specific and more enduring than that. It is that during typhoon season, when American flights are diverted away from Kadena, the Okinawans who live beneath the flight paths get a few days of quiet, and they remember every year what their island actually sounds like underneath the engines. The quiet does not last. By the 3rd or 4th day, the F-15s are back. The remembering is the point. What the people of Okinawa are asked again and again by the people of Tokyo is to accept that this is what national security looks like. That the island's location, closer to Taiwan and to the South China Sea than to most of Japan, makes it indispensable. That the 70% concentration of American bases on this one prefecture is not punishment, only geography. The people of Okinawa, again and again, have answered, "We understand, but you have not asked anyone else to bear the same burden, and we would like to know why."
That question, too,
was first asked clearly in 1945. To understand the present-day map of Okinawan grievance, the past has to be walked through, one day at a time, and the events that defined all of them happened over 82 days in the spring and summer of that year, in the southern third of this island. By March of 1945, the Pacific War was almost over. The Japanese Imperial Navy had been destroyed. The Imperial Air Force was reduced to suicide attacks. The American advance across the Pacific had moved north through Iwo Jima and was preparing for what every officer involved understood would be the final operation, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa was selected as the staging ground. The Japanese High Command knew this. They also knew they did not have the resources to defeat the American force that was coming. The 32nd Army, under Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru, had been ordered to delay the invasion as long as possible. Not to win, not even to retreat, to absorb damage. Ushijima was a career officer. He was 60 years old. He understood his orders. He moved his headquarters into a tunnel complex carved into the limestone hill beneath Shuri Castle, abandoned the northern half of the island without a serious fight, and prepared to fortify the southern third. What he did not do, what no one in the Japanese chain of command appears to have done, was issue serious evacuation orders for the civilian population. Roughly 400,000 Okinawans lived on the island when the war reached them. Most stayed where they were. Some retreated into the limestone caves that honeycomb the southern part of the island. Almost all assumed, because they had been told, that the American invaders would torture, rape, and kill anyone they captured. On April 1, 1945, 60,000 American soldiers and Marines came ashore on the western beaches of Okinawa, in what was at that point the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The initial landings met almost no resistance. The Japanese plan was to draw the invaders inland, away from naval gunfire, and grind them down in the rugged terrain of the south. It almost worked. For the next 82 days, the southern third of Okinawa Island became one of the deadliest pieces of ground on the planet. The Americans suffered close to 50,000 casualties, more than 12,000 of them deaths. Japanese forces were nearly annihilated, over 100,000 killed, including those Okinawans who had been conscripted in the months before the landings. Kamikaze attacks sank or damaged nearly 200 ships in the surrounding waters. The Americans called the bombardment they laid down before each advance the Typhoon of Steel. Most of those deaths, however, were not soldiers. Roughly 100,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, about a quarter of the prefecture's population. Some were killed by American shells, some starved, some died of disease in the caves. Some were killed by Japanese soldiers who suspected them of spying because they had been overheard speaking Uchinaguchi to family members. Perhaps 1,000 Okinawans were killed for this reason alone, and many, the exact number will never be known, died by their own hands or those of their family members after being told by Japanese troops that capture by the Americans would be worse than death. In the Kurama Islands, 15 miles west of Okinawa, American forces made a preliminary landing 6 days before the main invasion. On March 28th, on the small island of Tokashiki, hundreds of civilians gathered at a location now known only as the Suicide Cave. Hand grenades had been distributed by the local Japanese garrison the night before. A village leader gave the order. 394 people were killed within minutes. One survivor, a woman named Miyahira Haruko, was a teenager at the time. She has spoken about it publicly for most of her adult life. She says a soldier handed her a grenade and told her to use it. She says many of the dead were children. She says the order came from the army. Not all of the civilians who survived the battle did so on their own. In the southern caves, in the final weeks, a small group of American military intelligence translators moved with the frontline units. Many had been born in Hawaii or California to Okinawan immigrant families. They spoke Uchinaguchi. They had grown up hearing it at home. One of them, a man named Teruto Tsubota, made it his personal mission to talk Okinawan civilians out of the caves before they were sealed shut. He had been raised on Maui by parents who left Okinawa in the 1890s. He understood what the people inside the caves had been told. He understood why they believed it. He spent days on Mabuni Hill and the cliffs around it, calling into the caves in the language of the people inside, telling them again and again that they would not be harmed. Some came out, some did not. After the war, the survivors who had come out at his voice tracked him down to thank him. He had been doing the work no one else could. The Japanese national government, in textbook revisions during the early 2000s, attempted to delete the reference to military coercion from school history books. In 2007, in response, 110,000 Okinawans gathered for a rally in Naha, the largest protest in the prefecture's modern history. The demand was simple, that the textbooks tell the truth. The textbook publishers were permitted in 2013 to restate the historical record. The phrase, "orders from Japanese soldiers led to Okinawans committing group suicide," returned to the page. By late June of 1945, what remained of Ushijima's army had been pushed to the southernmost edge of the island, to a low hill called Mabuni. The headquarters tunnels under Shuri had been overrun in May. The survivors moved south, taking civilians with them, in some cases driving them ahead at gunpoint. The Americans pursued. On the night of June 22nd, in a small cave overlooking the sea, Ushijima Mitsuru and his chief of staff took their own lives in the traditional manner of defeated Japanese officers. The battle was declared over the following day. Sporadic resistance from soldiers who refused to surrender continued in the caves for several more weeks. Today, the hill where the battle ended is a peace memorial. At its center is a stone plaza ringed by long, curving granite walls. The walls are called the Cornerstone of Peace. Engraved on them are the names of everyone known to have died during the battle, regardless of nationality. Okinawan civilians, Japanese soldiers, American soldiers, Korean conscripts, anyone whose name could be confirmed. There are more than 240,000 names on the walls. New names are still being added as records are discovered. The walls were unveiled in 1995, 50 years after the battle. The decision to engrave American and Japanese names on the same monument was deliberate. The memorial does not separate the dead by what side they fought on. The Okinawan position, the position taken by the prefectural government in commissioning the design, was that the people who died were people first. The Cornerstone of Peace exists, in part, to make a point. When the battle ended, Okinawa Island was a ruin. Naha had been flattened, Shuri Castle was rubble, the fields were full of unexploded ordnance. The civilian population that had survived was, in many cases, homeless and unfed, with no government beyond the American military authorities who had arrived to set one up. That occupation lasted 27 years. The rest of Japan signed a peace treaty in 1951. Okinawa was excluded. The treaty designated the islands as a territory under American administration, and there they stayed. For 2 decades, Okinawans carried American military identification papers, drove on the American side of the road, paid in American dollars at a rate set by the American military government, and lived under American law on land that was no longer part of any country recognized by the United Nations. In 1970, frustrations boiled over. In the central city of Koza, after a traffic incident involving an American service member and an Okinawan civilian, residents rioted. American vehicles were overturned and burned. The American military police restored order, but the message had been delivered. The administration could not last much longer. 2 years later, on May 15, 1972, the United States transferred administrative control of the Ryukyu Islands back to Japan. There were ceremonies, there were speeches. The Japanese flag was raised over the prefectural government building in Naha for the first time in 27 years. Many Okinawans celebrated. Many others were quietly surprised by how little changed. The American bases stayed. The flight paths stayed. The land that had been seized during the battle, in some cases without any formal agreement, remained under American control. Approximately 28,000 hectares of Okinawan territory was still classified as baseland at the moment of reversion. In the 50 years since, that figure has been reduced by about 35%. The remaining 18,000 hectares are still off-limits to Okinawan citizens. The current governor of Okinawa Prefecture is a man named Denny Tamaki. He was born in 1959. His mother was Okinawan. His father was an American Marine he never met. Tamaki grew up speaking both Japanese and English, struggled with his identity as a mixed heritage child in a prefecture that was still under American administration when he was a boy, became a radio host as an adult, and eventually entered politics. He was elected governor in 2018 on a platform of reducing the American base footprint and opposing the Henoko relocation. He has been re-elected since. His policy positions have been overridden by Tokyo at every significant turn. He continues, regardless, to submit annual proposals to the central government. The most recent calls for what he describes as a peaceful and prosperous Okinawa, free of military bases. He acknowledges in interviews that this is unlikely to happen in his lifetime. He continues to ask for it anyway. In Naha, on a hill above the prefectural office, the rebuilding of Shuri Castle continues. In October 2019, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main hall and 7 other buildings that had been carefully reconstructed in 1992. It was the 5th time the castle had been destroyed. The previous 4, in 1453, 1660, 1709, and 1945, had each been followed eventually by reconstruction. The current rebuild is on schedule to complete in the autumn of 2026. The roof tiles, 60,000 of them, are made of mudstone and red clay from the local region. The timber for the main hall came from Taiwan after rituals were performed in the Yanbaru forest to bless the trees that were taken. The crowdfunding campaign for the rebuild raised close to $40 million from donors in Japan, the United States, Taiwan, and a dozen other countries. One of the more striking donations came from a woman named Mari Gregory, the spouse of an American Marine stationed on Okinawa. She raised $11,000 through a small online campaign and personally delivered the check to Governor Tamaki. That detail, more than almost any other, captures the strange present-day shape of Okinawan reality. A castle destroyed by an American battleship in 1945, rebuilt in part with money raised by an American military spouse in 2020. A kingdom that ended in 1879, still being remembered deliberately by people who never lived under it, in a language that almost did not survive into the 21st century. The descendants of the royal family are still here. Sho Mamoru, the 23rd head of the House of Shou, gave an interview in 2025 in which he described the 1879 annexation not as the destruction of Ryukyu, but as a historic decision made for Okinawa's future. He also said, more quietly, that Ryukyu had never truly been subordinate to China, that the tributary relationship was equal diplomacy rather than political subordination. It is the careful language of a family that survived 400 years of standing between larger powers and has not forgotten how it was done. Out on the eastern reefs, the dugongs are gone. On the high ridges of Yanbaru, the flightless rail walks. In Ogimi, the elders sit with their friends and drink tea. In Okinawan, the marine transports take off and land. In Naha, the new roof of Shuri Castle catches the morning sun and reflects it red across the city below. 70% of the American military presence in Japan is still concentrated on this one prefecture. The fence at Henoko Bay continues to push out into the sea. The Senkaku Islands, 80 miles north of Ishigaki, sit at the center of a quiet maritime dispute with China that could turn loud at almost any time. The frontline islands of Yonaguni and Miyako have been quietly fitted with new Japanese missile installations in the last 5 years. The geographic position that made the kingdom rich is the same geographic position that has, for centuries, made it strategically essential to whoever happened to be nearby with a fleet. The island Japan almost gave up twice is also the island Japan cannot afford to give up. The people who live there understand this perfectly. They have lived with the contradiction for 150 years. They have buried their dead. They have rebuilt their castle 5 times. They have kept their language against the odds in songs and prayers and family memory. They have asked for help from a central government that has rarely chosen to give it.
And they have not.
Against every reasonable expectation, stopped being Okinawan. Whether they will still be able to say that in 50 years, when the last fluent speakers of Uchinaguchi are gone, when the Henoko fill is complete, when the next generation of children learns its history from textbooks that may have been quietly edited again, that question does not have an answer yet. The cornerstone in Mabuni waits for new names. The castle on the hill in Naha waits to reopen. The dugongs are not coming back. Take a breath. Stay a while. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next journey.